You can't keep doing this! You can't keep giving us great games and create shitty sequels, expecting us to enjoy them just as much as the first! You need to do better! Konnichiwa, fellow otakus, CosmoK13 here. So a while back, I ended up doing a review of a fan game for the YouTuber Jacksepticeye, one he hasn't played, but despite that has become somewhat popular in the fandom. Septiscape was created by a group called Power of Friends Games, and it was a really well-developed and creative experience. What made the game separate from other Jacksepticeye fan games is that rather than focus on the Irishman himself, it focuses more on his egos and how the community sees them, concept that not even Sarcastic Pasta was able to do until the sequel of The Boss. I ended up playing the game with my friend Wolf Mama, and still holds up to this day, even years later. Yes, there are some flaws and nitpicks I have with the game, but overall, I still think it's a work of art and shed a new angle of light on the Septiceye egos. It was a refreshing fan game that didn't rely solely on just references from Jack's playthrough and had an organic storyline. Now, of course, Power of Friends Games has already planned on making Septiscape a trilogy and already had the other two games picked out, SoulScape and Endscape. SoulScape came out 2 years after the first game, and while Endscape is still being worked on, I'm here to talk about the sequel of Septiscape. A lot of us were really excited about a sequel, myself included. Much like Septiscape, Wolf and I played the game on our channel. Now, at first, I enjoyed the game and found myself immersed in it. But as time went on, I began to notice the faults of SoulScape, and I don't mean the little nitpicks that I did with the prequel. Unlike Septiscape, where I thoroughly enjoyed the experience and went back to it over and over, SoulScape just didn't give me that same satisfaction. For a long time, I never knew why. But here I am to finally lay it down on you all. SoulScape is not a good sequel. Alright, I know I may seem like that kind of critic, but I'm the only one who saw through it. No one else seems to be talking about this. They're praising all the wrong things for SoulScape. It's something I can no longer stay silent about. It has to be said. Frankly, this review has been a long time coming. I know a lot of you who are watching this are fans of the devs and admire their work, and I may get plenty of hate comments for this, but before you do, I implore you to wait until the end of the video and hear me out. Before you judge me on the why, let me explain the how. I know you all think highly of the devs, but if you take off your rose-colored glasses and break down SoulScape, you may end up coming to the same conclusions as me. Now, I'm not trying to bash on the devs or the community of Scape group. I still love Septiscape. I'm just trying to state the reasons why the sequel doesn't work and is an insult to what the fanbase has created. I know the devs worked hard on these games, but it's all the more reason they should hear this out, because they need to be reminded why Septiscape worked, but SoulScape does not. Now, in my Septiscape review, I covered the story while going through the details about the world and the mechanics of the game. However, since I have a stronger opinion on the sequel, I'm going to explain the main premise of SoulScape first, the plot and the events of the storyline. Then I'm going to explain the main points that make the sequel a flaw, followed up by the ways that they could have improved on the game. So with that in mind, let's dive right in and take a look at this mess known as SoulScape. SoulScape takes place 2 years after the events of Septiscape. Jack managed to make peace with Angus, and the Mindscape is no longer corrupted. Angus is still using the identity as Auntie, and only Bing knows who he truly is. Henrik knows his real name, but doesn't understand the context behind it. For the most part, things have become peaceful, and Angus has gotten closer to the other Septiceye egos. The story starts off with the canon egos going on a camping trip. They're setting up their tents, Marvin is cooking by the fire, all seems well, until Angus gets nightmares about being in a strange area. The ground is gray, there are realistic eyeballs watching over him, and a strange creature is stalking him around every corner. Now, remember in my review of Septiscape where there was an Easter egg you found in a treehouse, and if you touched a teddy bear, you had to battle a certain abomination that looked kind of similar to Auntie? And remember how I told you this character would be brought back up in the sequel? Well, here he is, as disturbing as ever, especially up close. As of now, this creature refers to himself as Hollow and wants Angus to give him back his soul. Hollow resorts to stabbing Angus in his dream, and when he wakes up, the survival hunter is himself again. Confused about the state he's in and worried that Posse and Edgar are not as connected to him, Angus goes to find Henrik to figure out what is wrong. The doctor states that the anti-souls are no longer supporting Angus, and unless they can fix his soul, he will end up dying. Again. So now, Henrik and the other Septiceye egos have to create a soul serum in order to fix up Angus's soul before it's too late. Now, I want to point out that I generally love this concept. Angus is forced to be himself, and having his soul be put in danger, it's a good plot line. I think it's actually an interesting story fit for this sequel. The problem I have is the execution of the story, but I'll explain more of that later. In order to create a soul serum, Henrik needs to collect 6 soul shards, pieces of the ego's souls that are extracted from a powerful memory, in this case, really traumatic ones. He needs 5 from different donors and 1 from Angus himself. So Chase, Jackie, Marvin, Henrik, and Bing all agree to go into their memories and have to face a manifestation of their fears and traumas to collect the soul shards. Traumas that the egos got corrupted with in the first game, which means this comes back to bite us. For Chase, his memory was when he and Stacy officially broke up after realizing the abuse he had been under her for so long. Jackie's powerful memory was when he kept having run-ins with the bullies from the Cool Patrol video, even after becoming a hero. Marvin was when he hired con artists who kept sabotaging his shows in order to gain insurance money from the magician. Henrik is the saddest one of them all in my opinion, mostly because his memory was the day he lost his wife Jolene and failed to save his daughter Emma, which is the most realistic situation and makes it all the more heartbreaking. Bing's is just as bad, the memory of when he lost Angus, but I don't think it's as impactful since we don't actually get to see too much of the memory. It is sad though, losing a loved one is never easy, though I feel more empathy for Henrik since, well, at least Bing got Angus back. Henrik didn't get his family. During these memories, they have to face miniature manifestations that relate to the fears and insecurities that the egos have gone through because of these events. Basically, the black glitchy creatures you see in SoulScape, except they're in each of the egos' mind rather than scattered throughout the mindscape. The manifestations are different based on the egos themselves. There's also these small Easter eggs you can find involving little manifestations that are supposed to look like the egos, and if you manage to convince them to overcome their worries, you can get a special item associated with the ego's goop. They don't really do anything for you battle-wise, but they are fun to collect, and it's somewhat satisfying to help these little fellas overcome their doubts. One of the things I do like about SoulScape is the improvement of the art style. One of the devs, Ben, was the person who created the cutscenes and the sprites for a lot of these characters in both Scape games. His artwork is definitely improved, both cutscene and battle-wise. I also like that we're taken to the actual area of battle rather than just a small pocket space, like we get to battle Stacy in Chase's neighborhood when we fight her. That's pretty cool. Though I will admit, not all the artwork is better for every character, the manifestations mostly. They don't look as threatening as they did in SoulScape. Sure, they look smoother and you can tell them apart better than the first game, but there's just something interesting about the pixelated versions that look similar to Anti. Then again, since those manifestations in SoulScape were based more off of Angus's fears, I'll give it a pass. Though I do wish they had done more with the final manifestations, the ones you have to face to get the Soul Shard. Stacy, the bullies, the con artist, Henrik's guild, and Morning Bing, I like that they are the holders of the Soul Shard and the battles are pretty fun, but I'm not a huge fan of their designs. They mostly look the same, just melting figures. I get that they are the goop monsters, just a stronger variant, but they're supposed to actually resemble physical people, so wouldn't it make sense that their monster versions were that much more disturbing? I'm not asking for Silent Hill or Resident Evil designs, just something to really separate them from one another. Like Stacy could have a two-face expression where one half is sweet while the other side of her face is angry and twisted. It would make sense given her character since she tries to be nice to everyone in public, but underneath she's only a monster to her husband and kids. The bullies could be more muscular or taller to show how much bigger they are compared to Jackie. Maybe the con artists could have been given different masks that featured animals to help tell them apart easily, and in the battle they have those animalistic features. These characters are the reasons that the egos suffered mental breakdown, so it gives all the more reason that they should be the most ugly and have more development on their models. The battles haven't really changed. It's the same RPG turn-based style that we got in SoulScape. It is pretty smooth, or I'll give it that. You only have a certain number of party members, depending on which member you go into, but you'll always have Henrik, Angus, Posse, and Nega in your party. You'll also be able to get weapon upgrades and equipment to add to the egos to help strengthen them, which you can buy with boss bucks. Unlike the first game where you go to buy them from the Puppet Chat, you instead get them from Tim and Tom from Animal Crossing. Okay, who the hell did the artwork for these demon spawns? That is terrifying even for the Scape series standards. I get that Sean made fun of the fact that Animal Crossing is like hell, but did you really have to make their avatars nightmare fuel? And what's worse, you can only buy set items when you're in the dream world. I guess it makes sense given that's where most of the fighting and money is, but it also seems odd that you can see them again and again in every one of their dreams, even in the final world, which, how and why? While battling the manifestations, you may come across certain emotions that will get a certain ego riled up, so you have to find ways to calm and ground them. If you do, certain manifestations will leave you alone, but you have to be careful with what you say because one wrong sentence and you will end up fighting them instead. Another interesting detail, I'll give it that. But one of the main problems I do have with battle mechanics is that unlike its predecessor, there aren't any health bars for the monster. Whenever you go into a battle, you're just faced with the obstacle in front of you and you can't tell how much HP they have. I hate it when they do this, when the developers decide to say, oh, look, a monster. I wonder how many hits it will take to knock them out. You'll have to find out yourself. I'm not saying that every battle game needs the enemies to have health meters over their heads at all times, but if it's an RPG-style battle game, that's usually a main feature they have. Undertale had, as well as other YouTuber fan games like Hearts and Heroes. Even the boss had health bars, and you never really fought in that game. I wouldn't find this so much of an issue, except if you add the fact that SoulScape had health bars for the enemies. You had this feature in your first game. Why did you not include this in your sequel? I know it's a nitpick, but what was their excuse? What, did they just forget the health bars? Okay, I'm really ranting at this point, so let's just finish up the story. Once you collect the 5 soul shards, you try to get one from Angus, but the group instead ends up in the Omniverse, the home of Auntie. And yes, Omniverse was the real Auntie this whole time. It was handed us the information even though it was plainly obvious. Auntie had been haunting and tormented Angus throughout the whole ordeal, and now you have to fight him on a rooftop, only for Posse and Nigga to intervene. They see a flashback of Auntie when he's a baby, and I'll be honest, I did squeal at this because come on. Basically, they learned that the Omniverse was supposed to replace the Mindscape, but when Angus stole Auntie's souls, they ended up in a limbo state. So Angus gives Posse and Nega back to Auntie, and Auntie gives Angus a soul shard that he got from someone. Auntie is fixed, Angus is fixed, they have a birthday bash for Auntie, and all the shit Auntie put them through is forgiven because fuck consequences. Oh god, it's over now. We can finally address the problems. I hated this sequel with a passion. While it does have some interesting ideas, there are just as many holes that make the ship sink. We've been living in an era where sequels of great games have proven to not live up to their predecessors, and this is one example. Honestly, SoulScape is just as much of a mess as the start of 2020, and considering this game came out within that year, yeah, that should have been our first sign. It's not really gameplay's fault. While there are some things I dislike about it, those are just nitpicks in comparison to the true flaws, the story and construction of the plot. So, what are the main problems with SoulScape? There are a total of 6 main problems I find with it. Throughout the game, we are tormented as Angus by this creature that refers to himself as Omitted. He's the one that separated Pasi and Nega from Angus's soul and put him in this danger to begin with. While I'm not against Anti himself, I don't appreciate the way they made his character, nor do I like how they made him the quote-unquote bad guy. The first issue I have with Anti is that they don't know how to make his character. Anti has been tormenting Angus throughout this whole story, trying to get under his skin and going as far as to stress him out. We know why this is because Angus took Anti's soul to save himself, and Anti wants his soul back. But this only creates an issue with the character. Anti's main goal is to regain what he lost. The problem is he's not really doing that. He has the ability to take Pasi and Nega back from Angus this whole time, but he never does. We know he's capable of this in the beginning, but he really just torments Angus to be an ass, not because he's getting what was stolen from him. Sure, one could argue that Anti just wants to make Angus suffer for the damage she caused, but at the end of SoulScape, Anti is seen to have been a child, a young innocent who had his life snatched from him unfairly. If that's the case, this only makes his character even more poorly written. Think of this, if you were a child and you ended up having your soul taken from you by the man you know who did it, would you A, try and go after them in a vengeance-fueled manner to make them suffer the same you did, or B, be scared of them because they would probably only do worse damage to you and your home? I may not have a degree in child psychology, but I'd say that B would be the more logical option. If Anti did have his soul taken like that, he would be going through just as much trauma as the Eagles. Realistically, Anti wouldn't even want to go near Angus because of that fear Angus instilled in him. Having your soul taken is a traumatic and disturbing experience that I doubt Anti would have gotten over even though it had been 5 years. Sure, maybe he could have gotten the courage to face Angus, but that doesn't justify his action to torment him. At the most, Anti would only get his soul back and then run off. That's all Anti wants. His soul, which was stolen from him. There is no justification to have him keep tormenting Angus this way. No excuse or reason. On top of that, killing Angus should be the last thing that Anti would do, because it's mentioned by Henrik that if Angus dies, Pasi and Nega will die since they are still connected to Angus, which means Anti is actively destroying his soul in the process. And before any of you comment on the fact that, well, maybe Anti didn't know him tormenting Angus and draining his soul would hurt Pasi and Nega. No. Anti lived his whole life in a science lab, and there is proof that he must have been aware of soul science, since we do see a soul shard extraction machine during the flashback. Not to mention he must be aware of the concept of souls, since he knew that was what was taken from him. Therefore, if he knew that if his souls were still connected to Angus, he shouldn't have tried to kill him like this. All the more reason why him attacking Angus makes no sense. Another issue I have with Anti is how easily forgiven he was despite what he had put Angus through. Towards the end, Angus gives Pasi and Nega back to the child, and afterwards everyone just accepts Anti as one of their own. I don't like how this conflict is resolved, as it just seems to dismiss Anti's wrongdoings towards Angus, because he seemed justified by doing it, almost as if they use his trauma as a reason rather than an excuse. The problem is, we don't really get to know Anti well enough where we fully sympathize with what he's done. Let me put it this way, Angus was a far better bad guy in SoulScape. In SoulScape, they play Anti off to be this threatening, sympathetic twist villain, like what they did to Angus in the previous game, but it doesn't work here, unlike in SoulScape. Angus was a great bad guy in the first game because he met all 3 criteria. First, he was a legitimate threat. He kidnapped Sean and put him away in a tower while controlling his body and trying to keep the YouTuber locked away. Even when Sean escapes, Angus is constantly doing everything he can to derail his creator. He takes possession of the other egos. He creates puzzles and obstacles to distract them. He is an active threat because he's pulling the strings to make sure he gets what he wants. He knows what he wants and he doesn't hesitate to achieve his goal. Anti had plenty of opportunities to get what he wanted from Angus, but he hides in the shadows because it seems more like the plot is preventing him. He's not really a threat, more like a nuisance. If they had made it where Angus had to actually fight him in his dreams to keep the soul, that would showcase how vicious Anti was, but they don't. On top of that, we get to see the legitimate damages that Angus does cause during his corruption of SoulScape. We see the destruction of the world. We see how the Eagles have been influenced. We experience the effects Angus caused onto his world, which makes us take this threat in a more serious manner. In SoulScape, Anti's actions don't truly cause any kind of complications. We hear what he seems to be doing to Angus because of him invading the dreams, but we don't get to experience the actual damage he gives to Angus, making the need to save the survival hunters seem non-existent and forced. Again, if they had shown us Angus's soul becoming more cracked or broken, it would have evoked us to care, but we see none of that, so why should we? Angus is also a good twist villain. We don't know Angus's true identity until near the end of the game, but they give us clues as to who he really is. The yellow carnation symbolizing rejection and disappointment, how Angus felt after being forgotten. We see the one cross in the forest showing us that someone died, but we don't know who. Then we see the image of Bing with a survival hunter, an eagle we haven't seen before, but we know he must have died, explaining the cross where the yellow carnations are growing. The game gave us plenty of clues, but they didn't say it out loud, giving the player time to try and figure it out for themselves. And when Angus is revealed, it's a rewarding concept because we managed to piece it all together. We were right in this case and solved a mystery that explains why these events are happening. Unfortunately, we don't get that in SoulScape. They tell us halfway through the game who we are facing, the real Auntie that Angus took the souls from. Sure, technically we could have figured that out based on the design, but it seems odd that they would build up Auntie to be this mysterious figure we know nothing about, only just hand us the information halfway through the game, and even more so before the final fight. This only makes the revelation disappointing because it doesn't feel like we got the answer through a satisfying means. And what's worse, it doesn't even help us to get to know Auntie as a person. With the other clues from Angus's past, we learned that he's disappointed and felt rejected because he was forgotten by Sean and the community. We learn he's protected of the other egos because he knows what happens to those that are forgotten and doesn't want them to feel any of the pain he went through. Why he's doing this, what he did in SoulScape, and why he has the mentality that by taking Sean away from his body and controlling it, will be better for them all. Having Auntie's identity handed to us doesn't give us that feeling of learning his traumas and getting to know his character and reasoning, which brings up the next topic. Angus is far more sympathetic in SoulScape because of those reasons. While we see what his life was like and understanding his trauma helps, there is another aspect that makes us get attached to Angus. Throughout SoulScape, we get to see things through Angus's perspective and knows what he is thinking, what he's planning. We get to be there while Angus goes through these thoughts, and you can tell how desperate he is to keep the plan he had been working on for a month afloat, despite everything crumbling around him. But we also see how doing what he believes was right affected him. We see him regret making Marvin one of his puppets, but knew it had to be done to keep the others at bay. We see him getting upset with Bing for not signing with him in the final fight, but he also seems to be somewhat relieved that he won't be getting hurt. This makes Angus far more complex and relatable because even though he's going through with his plan, he doesn't like the idea of watching those he is close with suffer either by his own hands or Sean. This helps to humanize Angus and makes us really hope we can give him a happy ending as we are seeing him suffer just as much. Now, was this ever present in Auntie? Nope, this motherfucker has no problem with using his own dad to find an army of the Eagles, basically lying to him by saying they were after him. He has no sense of moral code for anyone outside or inside his own world, which makes it that much harder for us to connect with him as a character. His arc is not satisfying because we gain nothing from it. His actions are his cues and his redemption is just handed to him rather than just him earning it through our own understanding. You could have removed all the encounters that Angus had with Auntie after his soul was taken, and nothing would have been lost, because we learned nothing of him to begin with. Also, I failed to see what the purpose of making Auntie the bad guy in the sequel was. Wasn't the whole point of the first game that we shouldn't judge Auntie's reasonings and interactions because of what a single person or group thinks of them? Wasn't that the whole point of the other egos, that they are more than just silly characters? The game contradicts what we learned from the prequel, and it isn't the only time we do this with just Auntie, but I'll circle around that later. Another main issue I have with this game is that it's lacking in new environments. I'm not expecting a new mindscape that's been created in a 2-year span, but the new worlds are either bland, unoriginal, or we don't learn a whole lot about them to either get attached or care. One example is when we have to go around Attitude City to locate Jackie. At first I didn't mind it because it was nice to go around the mindscape and see if there were any changes they made to the city. But as we look around Jackie's home, there were no changes whatsoever. All that changed were the number of residents that were there in the location, but all the buildings and main areas were where they belonged in SoulScape. Even though I appreciate the nostalgia of going around the city, you could have cut the exploring part of Attitude City out and nothing would have been lost either. Same with Jameson's world. Even though I'm glad he has his own world now and he is a bit more involved in this game, you could have cut out that whole section where Henrik is exploring the beach before meeting up with Chase and Marvin and missed nothing. The Dreamscape areas aren't any better. All they are just the worlds that the Eagles reside in, but they are distorted. We've seen these areas already in the prequel and in SoulScape whenever we go through them when we aren't soul shard collecting. Not to mention the puzzles are severely lacking. In SoulScape, you have to go through certain obstacles just to get to the egos, and each one had their own unique problem-solving ideas. They may not have been overly hard, but they were pretty fun. Here, there aren't any puzzles. We go from point A to point B in the Dreamscape, fight some creatures, have to fight the manifestation holding the soul shard, and it happens in every single dream. There's no puzzles, no obstacles, it's just a straight line. It gets boring really fast. The only time we get any kind of difference in the formula was Marvin's memory, where you had to do a tarot card reading to advance to the next section. If you got the card wrong, you had to fight a monster. I like this this because it involves something with Marvin's character, but we don't really get anything else like this in the other Souls. It makes the journey too linear and not as engaging. The best part about going through the different levels of the first game were the puzzles, but all that is lost here, and there are memories that they try to bury deep in their subconscious. Wouldn't it make sense that they would have certain locks to keep them from remembering? I mean, the gym leaders from Pokemon had a better security system to prevent trainers from getting to the final boss than what we got. There's nothing in their dreams that captivates us or makes us want to explore the area because we've already seen these places. The only place that sparked any interest for me in this whole game was the Omniverse, the place where Auntie was born. I was excited to explore this new map and learn more about this sort of mirror world that parallels the Mindscape. It even had some engaging puzzles, which is what I wanted to see. But looking back, the main problem with the Omniverse, they don't really tell you anything about the world. They give us some information about what the building is, but they don't tell you what the people who lived there were like, the lives they lived. Is the Omniverse just the hospital, or is there more? There's so much potential with this area, but it doesn't feel as fleshed out as it should have been. And once you finish the game, the world is never brought up again, almost as if they have no plans on bringing it back. The Omniverse could have been this really cool final area for the last part of the game, but it only fills the glass halfway, and even then it loses its interest as it raises more questions rather than answers them. It's also hard for us to really feel sorry for the inhabitants of that world with what happened to them when we don't really get to see what their lives were like before the corruption. This leads into my next point. As I said in my review for SoulScape, what separates the game from other Jacksepticeye fan games is that we aren't just focusing on the YouTuber himself and his accomplishments on his channel, we're also getting to know the egos that he and his fan base created. The Mindscape is our very first introduction to seeing how the fans fully view the characters that were designed and brought to life by the man himself or by the subscribers that follow him. But what makes the game even more special is that the developers make a point that the egos are more than just that. Characters. There are people that some fans generally look up to, despite not being real. The backstories that are shown to us is something many people can relate to. Their charms and personalities is something many of us can identify with. The dreams they have, the goals they seek, they represent what many of us crave. They may not get as much development as the standard size, but they are more than just throwaway characters like the Appliers. I love that SoulScape makes it aware of how important these egos are to us, and how they rely on their creator and the fans to stay alive. Now with SoulScape, the main idea is that we go into the egos' souls and get to see their memories. I was really looking forward to this because this meant we could see the headcanons of the developers' plan on giving the egos, their backstories, how they came to be, why they developed such fears we see in the first game. And we do get that. Sort of. While we do get to understand the reasoning behind their fears we saw in SoulScape, that's really all we get to see. Don't get me wrong, it helps the player understand where their flaws and weaknesses stem from, but in terms of only focusing on that, it really does the egos a disservice for their characters. There's so much potential they could have done by exploring the egos. So many headcanons they could have shown the player, seeing what their lives are like on and off the camera, how they form these connections, but we hardly get any of that. The information we do get is what we already knew. Like I mentioned before, the memory sections are all linear and they only focus on getting to the terrible part of their lives, rather than having us see the events which played up to it. An example would be Chase's memory, when he officially broke up with Stacy. But that's all we really see, the breakup, nothing else. We don't get to see how the abuse started, nor do we get to see how it truly affected Chase and his kids, Becky and Daniel. We never knew how Chase managed to get custody back with his kids, or what happened to Stacy. All we get to see are drawings from the kids and a conversation with Henrik and Chase before the Vogler faced his abusive wife. The main problem I have with these concepts is that they're not well paced, only getting to the main event rather than building up to help prepare us. And because of that, we only learn what we already knew from Chase's relationship, rather than being given new information to truly help us sympathize with him and understand why it haunts him to this day. There's nothing we can call back to make us see the triggers that caused Chase to relive that terrible day. No indications as to what makes him believe that Stacy said affected him. Henrik's words aren't enough for us to be immersed in the vlogger. There's a reason why so many writers will live by the phrase show don't tell, because experiencing something is more impactful than being told it. If we had seen this type of behavior from Stacy herself through Chase's eyes rather than being told it by Henrik, it would have been more impactful because we would be seeing it from Brody himself. This is Chase's memory, not Henrik's, not Angus's, not even Stacy or the kids, but Chase Brody. He's the main victim of what Stacy did to him. He's the narrator we should be listening to because it's his life, and how he perceives it helps us to fill in the picture of why his life fell apart. A good example of this would be Peach from Hearts and Heroes. In her section, which is based off amnesia, we go through her memories to find a way to help her escape. We see things through her perspective, and any questions that the group has are answered by her. We also see how reliving these memories affects her in the past and in the present, making her the person she is today. No one else is there to tell her what happened because it's her story that she is telling. But sometimes the memories aren't just straightforward. They show up in sections and only give us small movies before we do a puzzle and continue on. This is how you do memory tracking in games right. They don't straight up tell you what happened, but you have to watch to the end. And again, having only Peach be the narrative when she is the main victim in this adds more to her character because it helps us see things through her eyes and makes us realize how she grew as a person. These were her struggles, so she should see how she faced them through her eyes. And making these memories linear only adds to the problem. Memories are not as straightforward as what people may think. Most of the time, they're going to be jumbled up and will be very difficult to remember certain details, especially the older the memories. Sure, we don't know the exact timeline these events took place with said egos, but if they are as traumatized as what we are to believe, then it only makes sense they wouldn't be easy to get to. Marvin and Henrik's memories did a fine job of displaying that by giving us puzzles, but again, they were very lacking, and it feels like they use the puzzles as a way to fill in the time rather than explain what the memory tells us to feel. From what I heard, the reason why the developers didn't go further into backstories, and I quote, because they knew if they stretched a certain traumatic topic, it would trigger out some players who have gone through these experiences. Buddies, pals, I'm going to tell you something right now, and I'm only going to say it once, so every POF developer in the back, pay attention. Ready? You already told us, the player, in the very beginning, what we were going to experience. You gave us the warning. We were the ones prepared for it. One of the main points of the Scape games is dealing with these traumatic topics. We knew we were going to be dealing with them. That's what made the egos more relatable, because they have problems that a lot of us can relate to. We chose to play this game, therefore it's by our own choice that we should experience these events. And we feel if it's too traumatic, that's on us, not you. A lot of people who are playing these fan games are young adults anyways. They've seen this kind of stuff, but they play it because of their own choice to help us understand these situations and see the signs. I understand that you're worried about triggering someone who has been through these kinds of problems, but censoring it or downplaying it only makes it worse in the grand scheme of things. We're living in a generation where these kinds of topics are at an all-time high, and the best way we cope with it is through the media. People play games and watch TV because it's their way of escaping the harshness that reality is giving them. That's why shows and games like BoJack Horseman, Infinity Train, Bee and Puppycat, Life is Strange, Night in the Woods were created because they are targeting that kind of audience. These pieces of entertainment represent certain problems people who have gone through trauma will be facing, and they help them to realize that no, this stuff isn't normal. It's okay to get help. They don't sugarcoat such topics when it comes to it. They blatantly say it to the player or viewer because they need them to understand. They need the audience to listen, and the only way they can do that is to be real, understanding, and above all, sympathetic. They don't just tell us what the problem is, they show us the signs of how this trauma began. They show us how it affects them on a physical, emotional, and psychological level. What's more, they teach us how to see the red flags of when this is happening, and how we can either prevent it or help the people who are going through it. Beatrice's horseman story from BoJack wouldn't be half as effective if we only saw her mom getting a lobotomy and telling her daughter never to love anyone as much as she loved her son. If that was the only flashback we got to telling us who Bee was as a person, we would feel sorry for her, but it isn't enough to explain why this impacted her as much as it did. That's why we saw Bee's childhood with her brother and family, to see the flaws and strength these people had so we can understand that Bee was innocent before the family fell apart. That's why we get to see Bee's mom going crazy after losing Crackerjack, to help us empathize why Bee is so cold to BoJack because she doesn't want to get attached to him and be like her mom in case her son does die and she goes through a mental breakdown. Beatrice's story wouldn't be as impactful nor sympathetic if those scenes were taken out. It doesn't excuse her actions, but it makes us understand why she feels and thinks this way. Like I said before, the concept of showing in the media is more impactful than telling it, because we can witness firsthand how it impacted the person through their perspective, to help us put us in their shoes. Personally, we should be seeing more of this kind of stuff in other media. These topics aren't easy to deal with, but they are ones that you might be seeing in modern day. All the more reason why you should dive into these concepts and be more explicit to them. I'm not saying we need to see the ego's lives from when they were created all the way to this point, but we should be seeing other important moments in their lives and build it up to when the cause of the trauma originated. For Chase, show him how he met Stacy and see what life with them was like before and after they were married. Then put the details of when Stacy started to become abusive and when it started showing for Chase. Hearts and Heroes have given us this kind of concept before, and they handled it far better. The same could be said for the omitted residents. We're supposed to feel sorry for how their lives got ruined by Angus after stealing Auntie's souls, but because they don't tell us anything about what the omitted verse is, or give us time to explore the residents, it makes our sympathy towards them shallow and non-existent. We aren't saving the residents because we care for them, we're doing it because the plot demands it. I already gave my example of this, but I'll recap them. There aren't any puzzles to get the soul shards, and the ones that are there are pretty simplistic and don't take a lot of thinking. The paths to get to them are too linear, and you just beat up a bunch of manifestations. So there's nothing that really separates each memory from the last. There aren't any new areas for us to explore. Any new maps that are created either overstay their welcome because we go through them so many times, like Angus's Forest. They serve no purpose gameplay-wise or story-wise, like Jameson's Beach, or they don't give us any information or lore about the area for us to be invested in, like the Omniverse, Attitude City, Henrik's Hospital, Chase's Neighborhood, Marvin's Carnival. We go through them many times in both the real world and in the dream world. The Eagles don't have a lot of time to flesh their headcanons out. The story is too heavily focused on Angus, rather than dividing it for each Eagle to see their problems. With SoulScape, we get time to explore the Eagles' story before and after Sean arrives in the Mindscape, and we still get to hear their sides, even as the main narrative is going on. With SoulScape, we just go through their memories, get the shard, and that's it. They don't talk about their traumas again, nor do they ever bring it up for the rest of the sequel. The Mindscape itself seems to be lacking that POF charm. What made the Mindscape so interesting is that it represented Sean's mind because the Eagles live in his head and the worlds are ones that the Decepticons live in to suit their souls. Sure, there were video game references there, but they were spread out and scarce enough that it didn't feel like another Jacksepticeye fan game that focuses on his life as a YouTuber. Obviously, there will be some characters from the games he played, but they were ones that really impacted him, and there were just as many original people. A lot of the references in SoulScape were related to the videos that the Eagles were in, like Chad the Puppet, Danny the Cool Patrol, that kind of stuff. In SoulScape, we get less of the ego references and more games shoved down our throats. It's mainly in the Attitude City part, but there were other ones that I felt the developers put in because they had to make it feel like it was a Jacksepticeye fan game. Like in the very beginning when Angus is getting a cooler for the camping trip.
And though it doesn't take away from the experience of the game, it just seems so in your face to the point that it can get a bit repeatedly annoying. We get it. Jack played Undertale. You don't need a constant reminder of how often the fish lady and Skills Bro tend to set things on fire. As hilarious as it is, I don't always need to see it.
Welp, that didn't age well. Don't get me wrong, some of these references did make me chuckle a bit, like when Henrik tells Tem saying they were on spring break, but he tells Tem that classes have started because of fall. Honestly, considering how much quarantine we've done these past few years, that was too real. And at least they mentioned Unis and Honest. Don't really think it was relatable here since they were more Mark and Ethan's egos, but I'll give credit to the Memento Mori tribute. But yeah, they really up the game references in the sequel, and it only makes it more annoying as a result. Like I said, I love SoulScape because it focused more on the Eagles and Sean's personal life, and any gaming or entertainment references were more of a background gag and less related to the Eagles themselves. With the second installment of this franchise, it loses that charm. We see game reference after game reference instead of something more organic or related to the Decepticons themselves. Hey look, it's the raccoons from Animal Crossing. Remember when Sean played that game and made them devils? Oh hey look, it's Little Misfortune. Everyone loves that game. Remember when Jack played? Oh look, it's Billy, Clifton, and Jenny from The Boss. Look, we're including the characters from another Jacksepticeye fan game because we're so relevant, and this is still a fan game about, alright, I get it! I'm not saying I'm against these games that Jack played. I love a lot of these series. My issue is that they don't serve any purpose. Sure, they're neat Easter eggs, but they don't have anything to do with the Eagles. And while they were a fun throwback, they also feel out of place. SoulScape focused on the Eagles rather than Jack himself. And in the sequel, we are focusing on the Decepticons in their lives. So why are we seeing all these video game characters that don't have any meaning to Henrik, Jackie, Chase, Marvin, Bing, or even Angus? Sure, removing them doesn't change the story, but neither is keeping them. If they were characters that had some meaning to the Eagles, I would understand their importance. But did any of the Decepticons play The Boss, Little Misfortune, or Undertale, or even Unis Honest? No, that was all Sean. There's no emotional connection to the Eagles with these characters. And even though we do have the option to interact with them, there are so many in just Attitude City alone. This is why the part of finding Jackie to help Robbie irritates me, because it doesn't feel like we're finding the hero, we're just going around the city to see these references. And oh boy, are there a lot of them. So many, I'm just going to go through them, so feel free to pause and read. There are so many questions in SoulScape that don't get answered. This is another problem when it comes to the main story of SoulScape. Nobody tells us anything. Even after finishing the game, there are still so many questions left unanswered. Like what Auntie's plan was after he would kill Angus and get his soul back. Why was the Omniverse created before the Mindscape? As mentioned before, the biggest problem with the story is that it's not well constructed. We're focusing on the wrong aspects instead of learning the truth we need. Instead of learning about the Omniverse, we have to find Jackie to get Robbie out of a tree because no one can use a ladder in this world. Instead of trying to learn more about the experiments done on Auntie, we have to power up certain areas just to get to the apartments to find the Chimera. The biggest issue with this game is that writing, and then mostly comes down to pacing and detail orientation. I'm not saying we need to have all these questions answered in one sitting, but when many of them are tied to the plot and they don't give us the concrete information, that's where the story sinks. It's okay to have some plot holes now and again. No story will ever be perfect, and some of them can be hand-waved because they are convincing, like certain aspects of Resident Evil. The first Resident Evil game had plenty of plot holes that don't seem to have a solidified conclusion, like how the STARS members don't know anything about the Spencer Mansion, despite it being a Raccoon City landmark, or the fact that despite Jill and Chris getting bitten multiple times, they don't turn into bioweapons themselves. This is all just in the first game, but that's what Resident Evil is all about. Monty Xander, who reviewed Resident Evil Village, stated that it's fun to discuss the ridiculousness of the lore and storytelling among the fanbase, because there's always an intrinsic understanding that this isn't the point of these games. It's a badge of honor for a Resi game to be a schlocky mess. Contrary to popular belief, the series never went off the rails with its storytelling. It was never on the track in the first place. It was always full of plot holes and inconsistencies and messy details. It's become a part of Resident Evil's identity. Resident Evil had many of those, and many people who love the franchise, whenever new players come in and question things, the older fanbase will usually reply with, it's a Resident Evil game. While it is poorly phrased, it's a justifiable explanation as to why these plot holes don't matter when assessing the quality of a new entry in the franchise. Because these games will always have them. You aren't supposed to focus on the little things, you just need to get through the story and the main concept of what's going on. This doesn't work for SoulScape because the first entry didn't have any of these plot holes. Many of the answers we get through the narrative of Septiscape were answered either by us from the clues we found, or they were outright told to us. Why did Angus react after getting dosage of the serum Henrik gave him? Because they triggered his memories of his past life. How did the other egos get infected with the serum despite not being injected? Because Angus was controlling them using his anti-powers. What was the deal with the glowing orb that Sean had to heal the egos? That was the positive half of the anti-soul that was trying to find Angus. All those burning questions that were part of the storyline were answered in a satisfying conclusion. Any other plot holes that don't get answered were not answered because they weren't part of the main narrative of that story. SoulScape plot holes are problematic because they are at the heart of the game. They make up the main premise of the narrative, and when we get to the main climax, there are still so many questions left unanswered. Chris's characterization in the Burroughs Bridge and Village, they aren't justified because there is zero reason or explanation as to why they were in the story. Even after everyone gets their quote-unquote happy ending, many mysteries are still left for us to ponder. And yeah, we could go to the developers for the answers, but we shouldn't. We don't need the devs to tell us what is going on. We should be able to get the answers from the games. Any plot holes that are left unanswered should be ones that contribute nothing story-wise. This isn't about it being a fan game. Even fan games are capable of explaining to us the basics of storytelling and leaving out little to no plot holes. Hearts and Heroes and the Boss, despite having some flaws and questionable choices, manages to answer most of our burning questions about the story. Sure, one could argue that they may be able to answer these questions in the third installment, Endscape, but by that only serves to create more problems because A, a lot of these questions are based around the plot of this game, not the plot of Septiscape or the plot of Endscape. All of these questions are focused on SoulScape's narrative. Answering them in the final installment won't serve any purpose because at that point, it would not be necessary to answer them. Everything in SoulScape was solved in the end. They got their happy ending, so why would we care about these questions anymore in Endscape? At that point, it would be too late for an explanation because we would have moved on. And B, you're making it too obvious that there's going to be a sequel. I feel like the developers aren't answering some of these questions because they want to be cheeky and save them for Endscape. It feels like sequel bait, but why are you giving us sequel bait in the first place? We already know this is going to be another Escape installment. You told us that, especially in the end credits. There was none of this Septiscape, so why are you giving us this in the Soul version? It serves no purpose because we know what we are getting. It only seems more like an excuse rather than a reason. Like I said, Septiscape didn't have any of this foreshadowing bowl that they placed at the end. They only gave us the scene with Angus meeting Posse and Nega, then the hunter thanking us for playing the game and remembering him. It was wholesome and we were content with the story ending this way. SoulScape's ending doesn't work because so many questions are still left unanswered, and this happiness isn't earned. But now we come to the final point, where I saved the worst for last. The one that really drove the nail in the coffin for the funeral of this game. The one that really made me rage quit because it shows that everything the developers did in the first game was thrown out the window. We need to talk about the fourth wall trope. For those who don't know, the fourth wall is the space which separates a performer or performance from an audience, the conceptual barrier between any fictional work and its viewers or readers. In a traditional story, the character in a book, show, movie, or game interact independently of anyone watching them and have no idea they're in a fictional world being observed by millions. Because of this, we as the viewers or players are free to enjoy and partake in the events and characters all we like. There's a comfort to fictional characters that we will get attached to, whereas in the real world, people will have feelings that will react to you or speak to act towards them. Characters characters in the media won't because they are just following a script. While the fourth wall concept isn't something new and has been done in many media over the years, it isn't really something that is heavily relied on, and for good reason, as it shouldn't be used so loosely. In terms of using the fourth wall, it's only ever used for comedical or horror aspects, usually the former since the idea is to poke fun of the situation. An example is when there is something that characters don't know, but we as the audience do. In Paper Mario: Thousand Year Door, you're trapped on an island fighting one of the 7 crystal stars, but one of the crew members is actually a bad guy in disguise. We know that this is a grunt guy because of his body shape alone. He's just wearing different clothing aside from his signature glasses. After rescuing him, he looks in the camera and warns us not to tell Mario and his party who he really is. The reason this is funny is because we already knew this is one of the X-Nauts, and the game acknowledges us for figuring it out so early on. But no one, not even Mario and his party, who had fought this guy many times before, were able to see through his facade until he revealed himself, and everyone is so shocked, even though they shouldn't be, because it should have been obvious. This is an example of using the fourth wall for said purpose. Sometimes they'll even take it a step further by making fun of their own shows. Sonic Boom makes references constantly about its own program while mocking Sega and other channels about things such as how they don't try hard enough with their games, or how they keep rebooting certain shows, not because they want to influence the next generation the same way the original did, but because it's just using the brand as a term to make money. Other shows like Chowder and Gumball make plenty of fourth wall breakages for their own reasons. For Gumball, it's to call out the fans for doing things such as shipping literal children figures, or even the creators who had forgotten certain characters. Chowder, on the other hand, relies on the fourth wall to make many jokes transition, and in some cases have episodes revolved around it. These shows and games use the concept because they realize that they aren't perfect. They have flaws, but in most of these examples, the fourth wall has become a staple of identity to their narrative. It's become part of their universe, and because they know that they're in a simulation, that makes it okay because it means these jokes don't hold any dark meaning behind it. The main reason for why these shows work to a T, though, is because they are cartoons, and in plenty of cartoons, it was natural for them to break the barrier, even back in the old days. Recently, though, there have been a spike of using the breakage of fourth wall in a horror aspect. One of the most famous is Doki Doki Literature Club, a recent but very effective example. Daryl Talks games refer to an old BB show called The Experiments, where a mass audience was deciding what would happen to an unsuspecting viewer and making choices to have that man suffer. The main concept he was getting at is the reason why we connect with games, shows, and movies, etc. It's just so we can enjoy it from a safe distance. At the end of the day, no matter who we are, what we did, or where we are from, the characters on the other side don't care. With the online world growing, we are able to be anonymous online. The BBC experiment basically proves that when we do things where no one knows our identity, we feel a boost of courage and confidence to do certain things, because we won't be held responsible since no one knows we were the ones behind the act. According to Daryl Talks, games have the unique opportunity to break the fourth wall and then make a huge leap to identify something super specific about you, which makes you acutely aware that you yourself are a part of this and your actions are not anonymous to the characters. We go from a comfortable bystander simply pressing buttons to a participant in the action, responsible for everything that has been happening to these characters, and they know that. This is evidence when, say, you notice a character staring into the camera without warning, making you feel uncomfortable as someone is watching you through the screen. This is why we get chills up our spine when Monica calls us by our Steam name. When Psycho Mantis reads our memory card, it makes us wonder how much knowledge of us he actually knows. Why when Sans calls us a brother killer? Because he knows we killed Pap. Maybe not in this timeline, but in another. The purpose of the fourth wall is to include the audience in some way, so I feel we are part of the fantasy, whether it's for humor reasons due to us knowing something the player or characters don't, or it's horror related by having the game call out the player for something we did that affected the people within the story. And yes, SoulScape did do this before SoulScape. However, there is a main difference in the deliverance. SoulScape did this concept right for us. With the final confrontation with Angus, the survival hunter tells the player who he is and what happened to him. He tells us that he knows who we are and says he is the only one that can see the fourth wall. This breakage works because of the plot of SoulScape. Earlier, Henrik told us that when an ego doesn't get enough attention from the creator or the community, they have forgotten, and that causes them to die. When Angus calls us out, he has every reason to do so. The idea behind Angus talking to us as the player is because he is pinning the blame on us for his death, because we didn't remember him nor care for him, much like Sean, which resulted in his death. In other words, he's just as upset at us as he is by the YouTuber. This sparks fear in us, but also guilt, because the idea of that game was to realize how important the septic egos are, and they are more than just characters created by Jack, that they need just as much support from us, and that we can determine their stories and lives. Angus calling the player out helps to realize the gravity the situation will put these egos through. He includes us as the problem, and that makes it all the more spine-chilling. In the sequel, they make it abundantly clear that this is all just a simulation, talking about glitches, different antis, but the worst of it is when they confront the true anti and Angus reveals to everyone they are in a game. This is not real. Now, I have nothing against a show or video game becoming meta. As mentioned before, some media rely on the concept and it makes the universe appealing. My issue with SoulScape using this concept and embracing it is that it goes against everything the prequel taught us. What made Septiscape an organic experience was that we were diving into a section of Sean's community. The egos, what should have been a familiar concept to us, turns out to have more layers than we could have imagined. Marvin isn't just a magician that does party tricks. He's a caring and flamboyant ego that has a passion for performance. Jackie isn't just a brave hero. He has fears of living up to expectations and worries he will never be strong enough. Chase isn't just a cool dad that lost his kids. He's a supportive guy who will always be there for his friends when they need comfort, but isn't able to do that for himself. Henrik isn't a quirky doctor with a silly accent. He's the father of the egos who overworks himself due to guilt. Hell, even Auntie in Septiscape isn't a menace or outcast, but is actually a broken soul who had everything taken from him and was living a lie just to survive. Septiscape gives us a new perspective of the egos, showing us they are more than just characters that Sean created for his channel, that their story is also determined by us, for us as the fans. That was the message they were sending us in the first game. They made it even more clear with Angus at the end, thanking us for remembering him and playing. But in SoulScape, when they acknowledge that the world is a simulation, everything we had ever learned, all we worked up to this moment, feels empty and an insult. It demoralizes the idea that the egos aren't just characters, but putting them in such a situation, you're proving the opposite of what you were trying to teach us. At that point, we don't see the egos. We only see cold. All that bonding we had done with them up to this point becomes meaningless. All that pressure we had to save Angus never existed. Everything we were taught just goes down the drain. The problem that arises from this is that despite being told they are in a simulation, they don't really act up at all. If anything, they question it a bit. Angus goes on a rant and they fight and that's it. They are all happy and the revelation is never brought up again. So what was the point? They never bring it up again, nor do they ask questions about how their lives are dictated by the creators of said game. I mean, these bastards were the reason that Henrik lost his wife and daughter and why Bing lost Angus, as well as the suffering for Chase, Jackie, and Marvin. You'd think that the egos would be more upset to learn that such tragedies happened because of a group of fans decided to write about. But no, they just accept it. Like, what? Bolt had a more realistic reaction to finding out his life was a lie than these egos, and Bolt was a freaking kids movie. There's nothing wrong with the breaking the fourth wall, but there are still rules for that concept that have to be followed for it to work. One of them being that the breaking of the fourth wall is to include us as the audience, since the barrier is there to separate reality and the fictional world. We are usually in control of the actions of said characters, especially in video games. So to reel us in to make fun of our decisions or to give us a scare helps to shatter that illusion and makes us aware that we are just as responsible for our actions. SoulScape never refers to us or the players outside of the prologue. All the characters realize they are the ones in the simulation. There's no involvement on our part at all. So really, it doesn't affect us, just the egos. Other rules of the fourth wall concept are that it's okay to do it, but it has to be part of the universe. Again, this is why Gumball and Shadow worked with that concept because they used it constantly and it became their identity. Shows or games that rely on fourth wall use it because it's a staple of who they are. But with SoulScape, admitting this is just a simulation adds nothing to the plot. It only takes away our impression of the egos and the bond we built up with them to this point. You could have removed that scene with them learning about the world being a game and nothing would have changed because it doesn't do anything for the story in the long run. The final rule is if the fourth wall is part of the universe, add it on early in. So that way we know what to expect, especially if it's in the main plot. The boss, the Jacksepticeye fan game, tells us from the start that we are inside Jack's computer. We know right away we are in a world based off of the games he played. It'll feel more organic because of the narrative the story is going with. We are literally inside Sean's PC, so it makes sense that we would be seeing all these games or references because these games are stored within the system. Of course there are going to be glitches and patches and other tech stuff, because again, we are in a computer. This is to be expected in the world we live in. And even though they are limited to the areas of games that Sean has played, they're still created by making a world and community within the hard drive. The reason why this fourth wall breakage for SoulScape doesn't work is because it is in the center of the trilogy. They overuse it when they did in the first game, and adding it here takes more away than adds to it. It goes against the main premise that Septiscape was trying to establish, that these characters are more than just characters, but by admitting that they are in a video game, you are saying the opposite of what your first game was conveying. Yes, I know that plenty of games have done fourth wall breakages before, and I also know that the main idea for the fourth wall was based off of Undertale. And that is exactly why the sequel was doomed, with that premise alone. No, this is not a criticism of Undertale. I love that game with its characters and would recommend people to play it. What I'm trying to say is that there is usually a reason for developers to use the fourth wall. Undertale is a prime example. The idea of Undertale is that it's an RPG-style game where you have the choice to go a pacifist, neutral, or genocide route. You could spare every monster, kill every monster, or let some live or some die. The game centers around the choices you make. Depending on which characters you kill, bosses or not, will depend on how different the ending might be, either slightly or on a grand scale. But when you remove the surface of the jokes and humor and do a certain route where you kill most of the characters before the final boss, you'll get this line. Despite everything, it's still you. I'm sure a lot of Undertale fans can relate to this line as it's staple to the game. Schaefer's Productions mentioned this in his video during his playthrough. The main idea is that seeing such a phrase on a playthrough where you killed every monster you come across, aside from 2 before the main boss fight, is so specific and obtuse, it's hard to imagine any player doing it on purpose, shaded it by accident. The idea behind it is despite everything you as a player have done, all the killings and atrocities, seeing such a phrase, seeing your reflection, despite the monster you believe you become, is enough to have broken him. There's still a spark of conscience, light, humanity inside. And maybe it was a narrative that you let those monsters get away, with a feeling of mercy washing over you. What sounds like an accident turned out to have opened his eyes to the playthrough. That's exactly what Undertale is all about, that your actions do have consequences, but it's still possible to reform your actions and end your playthrough off on a merciful entity. Undertale is a lot more than just playing a video game where you kill all the characters on a branching path. What should have been a what-if scenario ends up making you emotionally invested and test just how far a person's morality can go if we remind ourselves that we are better than what people think. And to be fair, SoulScape did do this right, by giving us the option at the end of the game to either spare Angus or kill him off. Angus was like Flowey, and even though he had done some horrible things, knowing how much he suffered and realizing what he had to go through, it doesn't make it any better to kill him off. Even if it might be considered an act of mercy, doing so only ruins things in the end, just like how killing everyone in a genocide round ends up destroying you, the player. The problem with SoulScape's fourth wall breakage is that it doesn't do what Undertale was intending. Undertale works because there are multiple endings with different narratives. The Scape series doesn't work because there's only 2 timelines, one of which is already destroyed. Undertale works because it makes the player realize through their own accord and self-realization that they can still change and do the right thing. SoulScape doesn't work because none of the characters end up paying for their actions or get called out by it, when they should, like Auntie and Angus. Undertale works because we can do the right thing but still be given the option to decide for ourselves. SoulScape doesn't work because there are no options. We don't get the option to make amends with Auntie. If we did, then it would have made the scenario somewhat more satisfying. Like I said, the ending isn't something we earned by our own hands. It's just given to us even though we really didn't do anything to have gotten it. Angus doesn't fully grasp the consequence of his actions of taking Auntie's souls and causing everyone in the Omniverse to become corrupt. Just like how Auntie didn't come to realize or apologize for attacking Angus, since killing him would have done nothing to help him or his family. Undertale uses this concept to call the player out by using a more neutral approach in which having them be given the option to make better choices. You're using this concept because it sounded interesting, but don't understand the meaning of what it's truly trying to achieve. It wasn't about the timelines or fourth wall breakage. It was about growing as a person and coming to terms with that you still have the ability to change, even if your actions might never be truly forgiven. Even so, Undertale made sure that only certain characters still knew about the fourth wall. Like Sans, they used the breakage of the barrier to target the player, not the one being played with. And again, the game gives us, the player, the option to change things, not the characters. SoulScape passed that test, but SoulScape failed it horribly. Even though it sounds interesting to make the world be a game this whole time, it only serves to be a slap in the face to the prequel, since nothing we did in that game mattered, either. Undertale never overused the breakage of the fourth wall to the point that they let the other characters know they are in a game. Even their own sequel, Delta Ruined, followed the same principle. DR is more faithful to the prequel material than SoulScape was for theirs. Undertale managed to follow the rules, and that's why their use of the trope worked. Hell, Free Guy did a better job of this concept, and that movie wasn't even out when this game was released. SoulScape has its fair share of problems, but unlike SoulScape, where theirs was more charming and nitpicks, the problems in the sequel are on a greater scale. The main culprits are that of storytelling, pacing, little in terms of challenging gameplay, and overall, lack of continuity. It doesn't even feel like this is a Power of Friends work. It feels like a terribly written fanfiction. I also feel that time was against the developers as well. Clearly 2 years was not enough for the sequel. I don't understand the rush of wanting the sequel out within that span of time. It's not like they were an established company where they are on a time restraint, and I guess with COVID coming along, that might have been a factor, but we may never know. Overall, SoulScape ended up being a disappointment of a sequel to SoulScape. In fact, I even can't call this part of the Scape series with how far off it went with the story. Hell, I argued I'm more mad than just disappointed, especially with how much I love SoulScape only be given this poor excuse for the next installment. I know it may seem harsh, but that's how upset I am about the lack of POF charm in this game. That being said, if I had to rate this game, I would give it 2 out of 10. The only good thing about this game is the increase in art style with the extra cutscene and some animation, even though it only occurs twice and towards the end. The music still slaps, a lot is pretty haunting, with fits the somewhat grim themes. Even though some comedy bits were unnecessary, it did make me laugh. The fact that Jackie has 54 cats, how does Marvin allow this and not be jealous? But yeah, still a pretty poor game. If you're a fan of SoulScape, I wouldn't recommend SoulScape at all. It feels rushed, it's too confusing, not really a waste of time, but definitely a time waster. So what are your thoughts? Do you agree with some of my points of SoulScape, or do you think I was too hard on the game? Let me know in the comments. For now, thank you for having the patience to see the video to the end. With that said, sayonara, and stay classy, my otakus.